I had someone tell me last night, as word was breaking, of course, throughout yesterday afternoon and through the night, that Bill O'Reilly had been fired by Fox and will not even have an opportunity to say goodbye on the network. He's just simply gone. He issued a statement while he was in an airplane flying home. He had been on vacation in Italy, actually met the Pope when the whole firing was taking place. I had an audience with Pope Francis. I saw a comment from a friend, and the friend said, well, maybe they can replace him with Bill Clinton. He's got a good reputation with women. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. It's 7 minutes after 8 o'clock. Thank you for joining us. Tucker Carlson, who's having a remarkable and what you might call meteoric rise at Fox News, will be taking over in that time slot, which is 6 o'clock in the evening here in southern Idaho. Of course, on the East Coast, they do it at 8 o'clock. That's considered prime time. Carlson had taken over for Megyn Kelly after she left, and the ratings have been better. And Carlson had taken over for Brit Hume and done very well. And this is a guy who'd been fired from CNN and DNC, and now he is in the prime time slot on the most watched, not just any longer cable news network, but cable network in America. That is just an amazing turn of good fortune for him. The O'Reilly story, though, getting a lot of attention from the folks on the left who say, aha, another conservative exposed. But those of us who call ourselves conservatives never really saw Bill O'Reilly as being much of a conservative. I met Bill O'Reilly at a Boy Scout dinner. He was the keynote speaker, and one of my radio stations sponsored the event, and I got a chance to chat with him for a few minutes. Found him to be a very nice guy. But a little bit of background on O'Reilly and his friends and who he associates with. Bill O'Reilly went to the same high school as Howard Stern. If you didn't know it, the two are very good friends, and they're often seen at basketball games at their old high school sitting together. And then they had a third guy they used to pal around with named Donald Trump. So for many, many years, the three of them were their own little social circle. You know how Howard Stern talks about women. You know from an old tape that was released just before Election Day how Donald Trump used to talk about women, may still, but how he used to talk about women. It's very possible then that Bill O'Reilly shared some of those same, what you might call old-fashioned locker room jokes, and that may have gotten him in some trouble. A writer by the name of, I always love these guys who have these names, W. James Antle III. In other words, my family has money and I went to all of the right schools. He's writing at the Washington Examiner, Donald Trump and the GOP's enduring O'Reilly factor. I'll give you a few paragraphs, and I'm going to share with you a couple of sound clips on what may have actually brought O'Reilly down. The writer says O'Reilly was popular with a large right-leaning audience on a network that has successfully marketed itself to conservatives, but he wasn't in any meaningful sense a movement conservative himself, even to the degree that Rush Limbaugh and fellow Fox talkers Sean Hannity are. Now, if you're a liberal, you're not going to make that distinction because you think you're going to get a little political hay out of this today and, aha, a conservative exposed. Ha, we know what you're all really like. But most people, I had a fellow tell me last week that I was actually part of the mainstream media because I'm hosting a radio show in Market 250, Twin Falls, Idaho. And I wrote him back and said, and this was a liberal, I wrote him back and said, so you're telling me that Rush Limbaugh and the New York Times do the same thing? No. Then we're not part of the mainstream media. And you cannot compare Hannity and Limbaugh to Bill O'Reilly. The thinking process entirely different among the men. Mr. Antle writes, the man behind the O'Reilly factor wasn't a limited government guy. In fact, he often talked about how the government needed to step in and have a program for this or that. The top-rated commentator was better known for sneering at the mainstream media or kids who won't pull up their pants than worrying about the size of the federal government or lowering marginal tax rates. So it's not surprising O'Reilly is so often linked to President Trump. It doesn't necessarily mean that the median GOP voter is a movement conservative like Paul Ryan. And this guy says what the public has failed to understand all of these years, what the public has missed, or well, what the conservative movement has missed about the public. Well, let me put it that way. They got that reversed. The conservative movement didn't realize that most people, going all the way back to Ronald Reagan, they voted for Reagan because he was a populist, because he stood up to the arrogant media, because he was willing to pop somebody in the nose, because he wasn't politically correct. they liked his patriotism. They didn't necessarily vote for him because of school vouchers or school choice. They didn't necessarily vote for him because always of his foreign policy. They voted for him because he believed in the country and he believed in old-fashioned values. He was just the regular guy. I worked with a talk show host 15 years ago. Her name was Kathy Denman. Kathy, I wouldn't call her a liberal or a conservative, although she grew up in a working class family in Niagara Falls, New York. And she grew up with the beliefs that if you're on welfare, then you should go get a job. Is that a conservative view? Sure it is, but it's also a view that a great many people in this country have that aren't conservatives. And that's what we miss. Kathy was a very successful talk show host on a conservative radio station, even though she wasn't necessarily a Republican or a conservative. She always reminded me of when I was a young guy and I'd walk into a neighborhood tavern, and there's always a guy who's sitting at the end of the bar. You know what we ought to do about those North Koreans? I'd go in there and I'd incinerate them all. And that has an appeal to a lot of people. Now, we know it's not going to happen, but it allows you to get an emotional release. And Bill O'Reilly offered a lot of that on his program. This writer says the comments on our articles, the reader feedback we'd received by email or social media reminded us that there were plenty of people out there who didn't like political correctness or the liberal media, but weren't systematically ideological themselves. And he said, so did the overwhelming popularity of shows like O'Reilly's. Paradoxically, he writes, O'Reilly is losing his platform right at the same time vaguely conservative populism has made it all the way to the White House. At the grassroots level, he writes, Republicans are dealing with an O'Reilly factor they can't cancel. I thought that was the best, what you might call postmortem on O'Reilly's end at Fox News. Now, long before even Roger Ailes was dismissed from that network, there were rumblings that Ailes and O'Reilly were going to go leave and form their own network. And we've been hearing that off and on for the last 18 months or so. And you wonder if a lot of this actually has to do more with that, the fact that the folks at Fox were looking at the contracts expiring for these fellows and saying, you know what? As it turns out, most of the big stars at Fox already had outs in their contract that said if Ailes left, they could leave too. 8:14, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. A professor by the name of Tim Grosclose from UCLA and now George Mason University wrote a paper several years ago where he tried to set up a scale for grading people liberal or conservative. And he set up various numbers. Nancy Pelosi was a 100. That would mean very liberal. Michelle Bachmann was a 0. That would mean Michelle Bachmann was very conservative. Didn't mean she was a 0 personally. It just, that was how the scale worked. One side to the other, 0 to 100. O'Reilly ended up being a 25, which seems to be where most of America is. Not extremely conservative, but right of center. In other words, anywhere from center to some conservative ideas. And he says that's why O'Reilly was terribly popular. A big piece about this in Breitbart today. And the writer goes on to say Ben Stein of Sandpoint, Idaho, you may remember him from Bueller, or Win Ben Stein's Money, which was a wonderful talk show at the time it was on 20 years ago. Ben Stein is also at 25. He's got this great appeal to a huge amount of Americans because he's not an extremist, but he's slightly right of center, as was Bill O'Reilly. And that accounts for O'Reilly's popularity. I wonder, though, in the firing, and this is from Kirsten Powers. She worked for many years for the Clinton White House, and then when she left, became an analyst at Fox News. Kirsten Powers speaking to CNN last night. The other networks were all crowing about O'Reilly's dismissal. Kirsten Powers speaking to CNN, and it appears that O'Reilly's his fault or his crime was that he made blonde jokes.
I did his show regularly for a long time, and I was thinking about an incident that had happened early on in my career there, where I was on air actually with Margaret Hoover, who's at CNN now, on a regular segment. We were on every Monday, and he got Margaret's name wrong, and Margaret said, "Hey, get my name right," and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, there's a lot of blondes in this operation. I can't keep you all straight. Megyn Kelly's coming up," starts throwing all these blonde names, and then at the end of the segment says, "Thank you for your blondness," to both of us. So I went to his executive producer and I said, he needs to apologize and he needs to never do that again, or I'm not doing his show anymore. And I was told basically, well, you know, Bill, there's nothing we can do about it. He's a throwback. He's kind of an Archie Bunker. And I said, well, if you mean he's a Neanderthal, then we're on the same page. He can never do that again. I'm a political analyst here.
So he made a Blond joke, and they were infuriated, and they turned him in for it. Speaking, she referenced Margaret Hoover now at CNN. There's probably a joke about Margaret Hoover too, but I would get in trouble for that. I'm just telling you right now, if that was the worst that Bill O'Reilly did, then something more is afoot here. It doesn't, however, stop those people who disagreed with O'Reilly from dancing over the man's misfortune at the moment. George Will, the very excitable George Will. Well, I'm going to use some big words and talk really slow and never raise my voice and talk in a monotone. I'm smarter than everybody else out there. The atheist, I should point out, George Will, appearing on CNBC yesterday. It's all of these rival networks who think they're going to profit by this. George Will shares his thoughts on Bill O'Reilly's departure.
Any thoughts on that? This is a man who called you a hack at one point.
It's like being called ugly by a frog. Mr. O'Reilly is on air, is reckless, coarse, and bullying. Turns out off the air he's reckless, coarse, and bullying. So there's a kind of seamlessness here. I think Fox News has to decide what it wants to be and for whom it wants to be a news source. It seems to me that as long as Bill O'Reilly is the face of Fox News, and let's face it, he is, their ability to expand their brand and to diversify their audience and to become something other than a somewhat stale product depends on moving beyond Bill O'Reilly.
Here's the thing. He gets huge numbers. He's gotten even higher numbers in the wake of all these scandals coming to light, incredibly loyal viewers. How does that square with what you're saying?
Well, the question is, are they loyal to Bill O'Reilly or are they loyal to the Fox brand itself?
That is a good point. It's coming up on our break in just a moment, but let me share this. Many, many years ago in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, there was a top newscast, and it was so highly rated that it got better ratings than all of its competitors combined. And there was a fellow named Larry Kane who was the man on that newscast. Larry Kane ended up leaving, and he went to another city. A few years later, the worst-rated newscast in town sought out Larry Kane, gave him a big contract, brought him back to Philadelphia, put him on the air, and everybody said, oh, now it's over. The dark horse over there has got Larry Kane. And guess what? Nothing changed. The station that had been number one remained number one without Larry Kane, and he wallowed in third place with his new employer. I think, folks, we sometimes, those of us in broadcasting, think that the show can't go on without us. Wherever I've worked in the past, once I've been off the air 6 months, the people who are angry at first that I'm not there any longer forget me, and then they're very pleased with whoever comes along and takes my place. In fact, one of my old bosses left a station after 27 years, went across town to another station. 5 years later, he's still lagging in the ratings, despite the fact everyone said, oh, it's over with now. He went across town. 48 right now, 20 minutes after 8 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. More on this story in a moment. A friend of mine is an organization, member of an organization. He's been an officer in that organization called the National Association of Chiefs of Police, and he writes for Chief of Police magazine. His name is Jim Corey. Jim used to be a regular at one time on O'Reilly's program back in the early days of the Fox News Network, which is 21 years old now. And one day I asked him, how come you no longer do O'Reilly's show? And he said, well, it's because I don't get a chance to actually answer the question. He said, Bill usually interrupts me about midway through my first sentence and then pontificates himself. With Tucker Carlson, Carlson is a bulldog when it comes to sitting down and doing an interview, especially with some of the why liberals keep coming on his program. I think they all feel they can come in there and give him the what for, and they haven't been able to pull it off yet. Don't think that Carlson moving into that time slot to second what George Will said, and this is not an endorsement of George Will and his battles with O'Reilly, but to second what he said, the brand will continue to survive because of how they've branded Fox News. 823, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We're at 47. Quick note, if you're planning on building a new home and you'd like to get started now and perhaps actually be using that dream home or even a second home, vacation home by the end of the summer, I'd like you to give a look at Western Visions Inc. I have been telling you for the last few months how Western Visions Inc. can actually do a marvelous job with a lot of real craftsmanship when it comes to remodeling an old or historic building and turning that building into something really, really sharp looking while also allowing you as the customer to work with them on a daily basis throughout the process. In other words, you won't be ignored. But I haven't told you much that when it comes to the fact that they can build from the ground up, they can build you a brand spanking new home. Russell Smith, the founder of Western Visions Inc., has well over 20 years experience, not only at home renovations, but building homes, and in many cases, dream homes and very luxurious dream homes. If you'd like to know more and you'd like to get work started soon, I would recommend you check out the website, western-visions.com. That's western-visions.com. It's 8:24. We have a caller with us. Caller, you're up next, and you're on Top Story.
Good morning, Bill. But there's always a common denominator behind all these attacks, whether it's on Trump or O'Reilly. Certainly, we don't know exactly what happened, but they wanted to get O'Reilly out of there for sure, and under whatever circumstances. But the New York Times has been leading the attack on this country and what we stand for decades. The other night, after watching The King of Kings, Ben Mankiewicz comes on and said the movie just got mixed reviews, but the New York Times, he read the review, this excerpt, and it was just unbelievable. This movie was just the most despicable movie. That's kind of a summation of what they said.
And well, Abe Rosenthal, who ran the Times for many, many years, and I'm not trying to be, how shall you call it, anti-Semitic here, but his ancestors were socialists from a shtetl in Russia, and when they came to this country, they maintained their socialist atheist views, and that
right.
He inculcated that throughout the organization of the New York Times.
Absolutely, and so this has been going on, and the New York Times, of course, and like the mainstream media, is actually leading the Democratic Party, and of course, the New York Times was a big cheerleader for Hillary, and has been for all the socialist causes, all the anti-American causes throughout the years. And I'm old enough to go back to see all of this. And so it's just a continuation. And they won't stop with just O'Reilly. They'll go after Hannity and somebody else next.
Well,
because
you got to remember who was closest to Trump in media. And Bill O'Reilly was that guy. If you can't take out Trump, take out those people he was close to.
Absolutely, Bill. And so this is why I say anything, the Washington Post right there, you just look at the cartoons in our paper today, and Trump supposedly has no heart. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense that's out there, but everything comes from Washington Post, Bloomberg News. I mean, it's just fake news. Anything comes from the New York Times, but they're the ones that put together the dossier that supposedly brought down Bill O'Reilly. But, it's really sad day for our country. I didn't agree with Bill O'Reilly. He's certainly not a real conservative.
True.
But Tucker Carlson will be a great replacement.
Well, and I thank you much for the telephone call. You speak of the fact that we call our politicians heartless because they're talking about cutting the size of a government that is $20 trillion in debt. So if we end up in 4 years with a President Sanders or a President Cuomo, or worse, a President Clinton, it's not going to happen. But if we ended up with one of those folks and then we end up in a few more years $40 trillion in debt, you're going to find out what heartless government means. Bankruptcy means no more free lunch for anybody. But once again, liberals ignore that fact and insist that if we would just print more money or borrow more money and throw it around at a problem, that problem can be solved. Their argument is, well, we just haven't spent enough yet. That's a debate, of course. Obviously, I can get into it at a later point. I do want to point out, though, too, as well, O'Reilly's departure, some of those people who worked with him seem to be actually mourning it. Last night, Dana Perino filling in for him on a program no longer called The O'Reilly Factor, but just The Factor.
It is the end of an era here at the Fox News Channel. As we mentioned earlier, Bill O'Reilly is leaving this chair and this network after more than 20 years. Bill has been the undisputed king of cable news, and for good reason. He is an incredibly talented broadcaster who raised the bar for interviewers everywhere. He has also held his staff to exacting standards in his quest to put the best possible program on the air, and they are great. And you, his audience, responded in record numbers, making the Factor the #1 cable news show for more than 16 years. You have also been loyal, and we can't tell you how much that means to everyone on the Factor. In a memo to the staff today, Rupert James and Lachlan Murdoch, who run Fox News, described Bill this way. By rating standards, Bill O'Reilly is one of the most accomplished TV personalities in the history of cable news. In fact, his success, by any measure, is indisputable. We wish him the very best.
I will tell you that if you're looking for a prediction from me, the New York Times and its media allies will now start the drumbeat against Steve Ducey to remove him from Fox and Friends. Just a little inside baseball there that you'll see coming true in the next few weeks. Quick note, we had Dr. Jonathan Tripp in studio with us yesterday. We'll see him again next Wednesday morning between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. We do it every Wednesday, and we allow you to actually get a comment or question in for one of the medical professionals, a little free advice over the telephone. Dr. Tripp's office still looking for new patients, located directly across the street from the main post office in Twin Falls. They can often see new patients on the very same day that you call up and have an issue, medical issue. Often not, would be qualified. It doesn't mean every time, but generally that works out well for you. And remember, life's too short not to feel great. Liberals also dancing up and down because a Republican is leaving the House of Representatives. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes too as well.